The Black Reaver drifted like a predator through the void, its blackened hull absorbing the distant light of an unremarkable star. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and something acrid that clung to the vents no matter how many times they were cleaned. The ship was a relic of a dozen wars, patched together from salvage, stolen technology, and whatever its crew had managed to strip from their victims. It was a ship built for violence, and the men inside it thrived on that simple truth. Captain Vorthak stood at the center of the dimly lit bridge, one clawed hand resting on the metal railing. His reptilian features were framed by the dull, red glow of the control panels, his scaled brow furrowed as he watched the monitors with cold calculation. He was not an impulsive being. Impulses got men killed. And yet, something about this job felt different. "The package is secure," came the gravelly voice of First Mate Jorak. The cyborg's body whined softly as he moved, artificial joints shifting beneath the patchwork of scar tissue that covered what little flesh he had left. His right eye, a cold mechanical implant, flickered as he scanned the data readout on his wrist. No resistance. Station security never saw us coming. Vorthak exhaled through his nostrils. "You sound surprised." Jorak shook his head. "No, just it was easy." "Good," Vorthak muttered, but he did not share the sentiment. A low chuckle came from the gunner's pit. "She don't look like much," said Ralzek, his massive frame hunched over the console, for muscular arms draped lazily over his weapons array. "All this effort for one soft little human?" He bared his teeth in a grin. "Maybe she's worth keeping for entertainment." "Careful." Carvos muttered from the corner, where he was idly disassembling a pulse rifle, his grease-stained hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Zeltor doesn't pay for damaged goods." Ralzek rolled his shoulders, unimpressed. "We don't even know why he wants her. Maybe he won't mind if we have a little fun first." Jorak's gaze snapped to him, his voice turning sharp. "You touch her, and you'll answer to the captain." Vorthak did not have to say a word. The moment his slitted eyes locked onto Ralzek, the brute's amusement faded. He looked away, muttering something under his breath. The mercenaries were killers, scavengers, and thieves, but they were also professionals. The unwritten rule of the Black Reaver was simple: a job was a job. You didn't jeopardize the payday with personal indulgences. "Where is she now?" Vorthak asked. "In the cargo hold," Jorak replied. "Unconscious. Irek had to use a little extra sedative to keep her from making a scene." Vorthak drummed his claws against the railing, considering. "Bring her to interrogation." Carvos raised an eyebrow. "Already? Thought we were just delivering her." "Zeltor's instructions were vague," Vorthak said. "I want to know why." Jorak nodded and signaled to Irek over the comms. A few moments later, the ship's pilot appeared in the doorway, his wiry frame and sharp features illuminated by the flickering bridge lights. "She's awake," he said. "Didn't even flinch when she came to. Just looked around, like she was expecting this." Vorthak's gaze darkened. "Bring her." The Black Reaver was not built for comfort. The interrogation room was little more than a reinforced chamber with a single metal chair bolted to the floor. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of rust and disinfectant. Evelyn Carter sat in the center, wrists bound in front of her, posture relaxed despite her circumstances. She was unremarkable at first glance, slim, dark hair framing a face that was neither striking nor forgettable. But there was something in her expression that unsettled even Jorak, something in the way she sat so still, her gaze drifting from one mercenary to the next with quiet calculation. Vorthak stepped inside, Jorak at his side. Ralzek lingered by the door, arms crossed, his expression twisted with barely restrained amusement. Carvos leaned against the far wall, disinterested but watchful. Evelyn's gaze settled on Vorthak, studying him. Then, to everyone's surprise, she smiled. "You're all going to die." Silence. Then Ralzek let out a sharp bark of laughter. "That's so." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Yes." Jorak stepped forward. "Who are you?" She ignored the question, looking past him, past all of them, as if she could already see something they couldn't. You don't understand what you've done. Vorthack's patience was thin. He leaned down, his cold breath brushing against her skin. Enlighten me. Evelyn's smile didn't waver. You took something that wasn't meant to be touched. Ralzek snorted. You. Her gaze snapped to him. No, the chain reaction you just started. Jorik exchanged a glance with Vorthack. This was wrong. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't afraid. He had interrogated men twice her size, warriors who had held out against pain beyond imagining, and in the end, they had all broken. But she wasn't resisting. She was waiting. The ship shuddered. It was barely noticeable at first, a subtle tremor through the floor. But Carvos stiffened, his head snapping up. What was that? Proximity alert. Irek's voice crackled over the comms. We've got something inbound. Fast. Vorthack turned to Jorik, but the cyborg was already pulling up the hollow display on his wrist. His good eye widened. That's impossible. There's nothing in the logs, no ships in this sector moving at those speeds. Evelyn exhaled softly, almost like a sigh. You should have left me where I was, she murmured. The lights flickered. The ship groaned under some unseen pressure. And then the alarms began to scream. The klaxons wailed through the corridors of the Black Reaver, shrill and relentless. Warning lights pulsed in jagged rhythms, casting erratic shadows across the interrogation chamber. The mercenaries stiffened, hands twitching toward weapons. But Evelyn Carter sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as if listening for something only she could hear. Jorik moved first, his cybernetic eye flickering as he scanned the data streaming across his wrist console. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Whatever's approaching, our sensors can't get a lock. It's fast, but there's no heat signature, no energy trails. Stealth tech. Carvos suggested, already pushing past the others toward the control panel embedded in the wall. His fingers flew over the interface, rerouting power to external scanners, but the screen returned only static. Vorthack's tail lashed once against the floor, a sure sign of irritation. Irek, report, he barked into the comm. The pilot's voice came through strained, undercut by the distant hum of overloaded systems. It's just there, Captain. 1 second we were alone, and now. Hell, I don't even know what I'm looking at. It's like it wasn't moving through space. It just arrived. The words sent an unnatural silence through the room. Space was vast, distances incomprehensible. No ship, no matter how advanced, simply arrived. Ralzek's lips curled back in a sneer. Enough of this ghost story garbage. Get the guns ready, put up the shields, and if anything tries to board, we blast it to... The ship groaned. It was not the impact of a weapon, nor the tremor of sudden acceleration. It was deeper than that, a sound that resonated through the very bones of the vessel, something ancient and wrong. The lights overhead dimmed, flickering in an unnatural sequence. Evelyn sighed. You really shouldn't have taken me. The words sent a fresh jolt of fury through Ralzek. He strode forward, grabbing her by the front of her jumpsuit and yanking her up. Enough with the damn riddles. His breath was hot, fangs bared. You think you scare us? You're nothing but a soft-skinned lab rat. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. I am not what scares you, she said softly. Ralzek snarled, but before he could speak, the ship lurched. The force sent Carvos staggering into the wall, Jorik barely catching himself against the console. Ralzek, unbalanced, released Evelyn on reflex, stepping back as if burned. Vorthack's talons curled into his palms. His instinct screamed at him, something was watching. Evelyn Carter, he said, his voice low, measured. What is coming? She tilted her head. A correction. Jorik's patience snapped. Enough cryptic nonsense. He strode to her, placing a cold metal hand against the wall beside her head. You don't get to sit there smirking while our ship is under siege. Tell me exactly what's happening, or I will make you talk. Evelyn regarded him with something like pity. If you could make me talk, Jorik, I would not be here. The ship's emergency lighting cut out. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing but silence, the kind that pressed against the ribs, filling the spaces where breath should be. Then, from somewhere in the depths of the ship, there came a sound, faint, distant, impossibly close. A whisper. Jorek turned sharply, but the room was empty save for them. Carvos swore under his breath, fingers working furiously at the controls, but nothing responded. "We've lost command functions," he muttered. "Weapons are offline, shields aren't responding, hell, even the life support readings aren't coming through." Vorthak's gaze remained on Evelyn. "You did this," he said, not a question but a verdict. Evelyn blinked. "No, they did." Jorek's throat tightened. "Who?" She exhaled slowly. "The reason humanity is still here." Vorthak stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "Explain." "You think your kind dominates this galaxy because of strength? Because of cunning? No." Her gaze flicked to Jorek, to Ralzek, to Carvos, each in turn. "You all take what you want, believing there are no consequences. You steal, you kill, you betray, and it works, because most species are like you. But humanity is not like you. We should have been wiped out a dozen times over, crushed under the weight of species older, smarter, stronger than us." She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're still here." The whisper in the dark grew louder. Ralzek turned sharply, hands reaching for weapons that no longer responded. "What is that?" Evelyn's eyes did not leave Vorthak's. "It's what happens when the leash breaks." Jorek clenched his jaw. "You're lying. If humanity had anything that could do this, we'd know." Evelyn shook her head. "You wouldn't. That's the point." The whispering turned to static, a droning hum that clawed at the edges of thought. Carvos grimaced, pressing his palms against his temples. "Something's in the system," he gritted out. I don't know what it is, but it's alive." Vorthak made a decision. "IREC, emergency thrusters now." There was no response. Then a sharp, ragged breath over the comm. "IREC." Jorek pressed his wrist console, tension coiling tight in his frame. "Report." Static. Then a voice, but not the one they expected. It was layered, distorted, as though a dozen throats spoke at once. "Running is irrelevant." The sound cut out. Jorek's fingers curled into a fist. "IREC is gone," he said grimly. "They have the bridge." Vorthak turned back to Evelyn. "Tell me what they want." She held his gaze. "Correction." Jorek's breath was slow, controlled. "And us." Evelyn's expression was unreadable. "You were already dead the moment you took me." The hum deepened, the ship vibrating beneath their feet. The Black Reaver was no longer theirs. The walls seemed to close in, the very air thickening with an unseen presence. Ralzek let out a snarl and raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Evelyn's forehead. "I don't believe in ghost stories," he growled. Evelyn met his gaze, unafraid. "Then believe in what comes next." The lights returned for a fraction of a second, enough to show the shadows standing behind them. The moment of illumination was brief, no more than a flicker, but in that sliver of time they saw them. Dark figures loomed behind the mercenaries, their forms indistinct yet undeniably present, like silhouettes burned into the air. They weren't reflections, weren't projections. They were there. Ralzek reacted first. His instincts, honed by decades of bloodshed, screamed at him. He swung his rifle up, his massive fingers tightening around the trigger. But before he could fire, something impossibly cold closed around his wrist. His bellow of rage choked into silence. Jorek turned sharply, his cybernetic eye flashing, but whatever he saw locked him in place. His breathing hitched, muscles stiffening as if an invisible force had taken hold. His mechanical hand twitched violently before locking up entirely. Vorthak moved on pure survival instinct. He lashed out, claws slicing through the space where one of the figures stood, only to meet nothing. No resistance. No contact. As if his attack had never existed in the first place. Carvos, ever the pragmatist, made a decision. He bolted. Or rather, he tried. The second he reached the doorway, the air itself seemed to ripple, and he was back in the room. He hadn't turned, hadn't retraced his steps. He had simply been placed back, where he started. Carvo's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. His fingers dug into his own forearm. as if anchoring himself to reality. No, he rasped. No, this isn't real. This is some kind of trick. Evelyn exhaled softly. That's what they all think at first. Raoul Zek finally wrenched his arm free, staggering back. His breath came in frantic gasps, chest heaving. What? His voice failed him. He shook his head violently as if trying to clear it. What are they? Evelyn turned toward him, her expression unreadable. The reason you should have let me go. Vorthak's mind raced, processing, calculating. He had survived wars, betrayals, ambushes in the dead of space. He had faced horrors lurking in the void, creatures that defied natural law. And yet, standing here in his own ship, he understood something terrible. This was not a fight. He could win. What do they want? His voice was quiet, controlled. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him, as if deciding whether to answer. To undo mistakes. Jorik found his voice. And we are a mistake? Her eyes darkened. You took something that wasn't meant to be taken. And now, the ones who keep things balanced are correcting the equation. Raoul Zek let out a guttural growl. Enough. He lifted his rifle again, but this time he aimed at Evelyn. I don't care what kind of mind game this is. We kill her, this stops. That is incorrect, a voice whispered. It was not Evelyn. The words did not come from the walls, nor from the comms. They came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the very bones of the ship. It was neither loud nor quiet, neither distant nor near. It simply was, and then the ship moved, not in the way a vessel accelerates or changes trajectory. This was different. The Black Reaver was being rewritten, its structure shifting in ways that should have been impossible. Walls stretched, corridors distorted. The interrogation room expanded and contracted at the same time, as if reality itself was undecided on its shape. Carvos let out a strangled breath. We're not in normal space anymore. Vorthak's mind was a storm, calculations breaking down under the weight of the impossible. His ship, his territory, had become something else. And then the lights flickered again. The figures, once distant shadows, took form. They were not creatures, not men, not machines. They were something beyond definition. Their bodies, if they could be called that, shifted between shapes, edges blurring, as if they existed in multiple states at once. There was no symmetry, no pattern, only a sense of overwhelming presence. Vorthak had faced death before. He had met enemies that outmatched him, weapons that could end him in an instant. But this was something beyond fear. This was inevitability. And then they spoke. Not in words, not in sound. Understanding simply arrived in their minds. The mercenaries staggered. Jorik let out a sharp breath, pressing his fingers to his temple, as if trying to block out something too vast to contain. Carvos squeezed his eyes shut, but it did nothing to stop the knowledge from sinking in. Raoul Zek dropped his rifle. His hands trembled. The mighty warrior, the brute who had crushed enemies with his bare hands, took an unsteady step back. Vorthak held his ground, though his claws curled into his palms, drawing blood. He rasped his throat dry. What are you? A pause, and then, in perfect, impossible unison, the ones who hold the line. The ship groaned under unseen pressure. Metal warped. The floor beneath them no longer felt solid. Evelyn closed her eyes. They are giving you one chance. Jorik swallowed, his voice hoarse. One chance for what? Her eyes opened, and there was something distant in them. Something that did not belong to her alone. To make peace with the end. Vorthak's breath came slow and even. His body betrayed nothing, but his mind was racing. There had to be a way out. A loophole. A negotiation. But deep down he already knew the truth. This was not a battle. This was a verdict, and they were the sentence. Silence. It stretched thick and absolute, pressing against their skulls like a tangible weight. It was not the silence of absence, not the silence of empty space, but something deeper, a silence that consumed, that erased. The mercenaries stood frozen, breath shallow, as the presence of the being surrounded them. The ship no longer felt like a ship. It was something else now, a hollowed thing caught between realities, its structure rewritten by forces beyond understanding. The air tasted wrong, the walls seemed to shift at the edges of their vision, and the floor beneath their feet felt both solid and ephemeral. Vorthak exhaled slowly. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to resist, but for the first time in his long, brutal life, he understood that neither strength nor strategy would save him. "We are not the first," Jorek whispered. His cybernetic eye flickered erratically, internal systems struggling against the overwhelming presence. "This has happened before." Evelyn nodded. "Many times." Ralzek's hands clenched into fists, his entire body trembling. "Then why the hell don't we know about it?" His voice was hoarse, unsteady. "Why aren't there stories, records, something?" Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time there was something almost like sympathy in her gaze. "Because those who are corrected do not leave stories behind." A sharp breath escaped Carvo's. "Then what do they leave?" "The absence of a mistake," she said softly. The weight of her words settled over them, cold and suffocating. Vorthak turned his gaze to the figures that loomed around them, shifting between forms, existing in ways that defied comprehension. They had not moved, had not spoken since delivering their judgment. They didn't need to. The sentence had already been passed. But Vorthak was not ready to accept it. Not yet. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, forcing his body to move against the crushing gravity of inevitability. His claws flexed, but not in aggression. He knew there was no point in threats, no point in resistance. Instead, he did the only thing left to do. He negotiated. "You act as if we are nothing," he said, voice steady despite the void closing around him. "As if we are insignificant." His amber eyes burned with defiance. "And yet here you stand, giving us this moment. That means something. It means we have worth." The figures did not react, but Evelyn did. "You misunderstand," she said, watching him carefully. "It is not about worth. It is about balance." Vorthak turned to her, sharp and precise. "Then tell me the truth. The full truth." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before she finally spoke. "There are rules," she said. "Not laws, not systems, but rules, boundaries that hold reality together. They are not written, not recorded, not even spoken. They are." She took a step forward, and for the first time, the figures almost seemed to acknowledge her. "Humanity is not the strongest, nor the smartest, nor the most advanced," she continued. "But we have something that should not be. A deviation, a flaw in the pattern." She met Vorthak's gaze. "We are protected." Jorek's jaw tightened. "By them?" He motioned toward the shifting figures, his metal fingers twitching. Evelyn shook her head. "No, by something even they do not fully control." Carvos let out a hollow laugh, laced with something close to hysteria. "So what? You're saying humanity has some kind of invisible guardian force." He gestured wildly. "And yet you were taken. You were caught." Evelyn exhaled. "Because I was allowed to be." Vorthak's claws dug into his palm. "You were bait." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ralzek's breathing was harsh. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something. An escape, a weapon, an answer. "This isn't how it ends for us," he growled. "We are warriors, fighters. We've survived battles that should have killed us, walked away from wars that burned planets to ash." His teeth bared in a snarl. "We don't just cease." Evelyn looked at him with something resembling sorrow. "Yes," she said, "you do." And then the figures moved, not in a way that could be tracked, not in a way that could be understood. One moment they were distant, the next they were there. Ralzek opened his mouth, whether to scream, to curse, to fight, it didn't matter. He was simply gone. No sound, no struggle, just an absence where he had stood. Carvos choked, stumbling backward. His hand reached for a sidearm that no longer existed, his breath coming in panicked bursts. "No, no, 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 this isn't happening." And then he, too, was gone. Jorek's cybernetic eye flared wildly, sparks dancing along the circuits in his skull. His body convulsed as something unseen reached into him, disrupting every function, rewriting him at the most fundamental level. He didn't even have time to fall. Evelyn closed her eyes. Vorthak stood alone. The void pressed in around him, the weight of the inevitable crashing down. He had fought, he had bargained, and still the end had come. He turned his gaze to Evelyn one last time. "Tell me," he said, voice steady, "why are you allowed to stay?" Her expression was unreadable. "Because I was never the one being judged." Vorthak exhaled, slow and deep, and then he was gone. The silence stretched once more. Evelyn stood in the empty space where they had been, surrounded only by the beings that had erased them. She met their shifting forms without fear, without question. The figures did not speak. They did not move. And then, as if reality itself had turned the page, they were gone too. The ship hummed back to life, its structure reforming, its systems reawakening. The Black Reaver drifted in space, untouched, unscarred. Evelyn stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the console. Data flowed, responding to her presence. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. Balance had been restored. For now.